In 2005, Doctor Who returned to our screens. For all our sins. And it was therefore natural that with the return of the show to TV, that the Daleks, the show's most recognisable and popular element, would return with it. Well, that was always the intention, of course, but reports indicate it was a bit touch and go at points as to whether they'd manage it or not, as the estate of Terry Nation was intent on playing silly buggers, and that left Russell T Davies to invent a Dalek stand-in to be used in this episode, and presumably the finale as well, in case they weren't able to get the rights. The Toclophane, mysterious spheres that would have fought the Time War with the Time Lords, and that would have later been revealed to be humans. Of course, the rights for the Daleks were sorted out, and the Toclophane concept was reused in the Series 3 finale in a different way, but am I the only one who thinks the original concept was far better than what we actually got? I mean, let me make clear, this will be a very positive review, this is a great episode, but I think the potential of that Toclophane idea is just staggering. This Time War that left the Doctor so scarred was fought against beings he had no idea the true nature of, unlike the Daleks at a known quantity for both him and the audience. It's terrifying to just now know what he's truly up against, a truly faceless and emotionless terror. The pain of him desperately wanting to know what these things are, and no doubt the horror that they had in reincarnation of his favourite species, the potential is just incredible, I think. And the thing is, because the Daleks are the Daleks, they have to appear all the time, which means we see the final ever Dalek survivors of the Time War when they died at the end of the Daleks about 4 or 5 times, before they finally throw their hands up and hit the reset button on it in the Moffat era, which is extremely effective this first time and rather less effective the 5th or 6th time. Whereas there'd be no need for the Toclophane to appear that often. This episode, the finale of this series, and then, if you wanted to, that could have been it, or maybe save them for when you really need them later on. And of course, we could have still have the Daleks just becoming less silly that they somehow keep popping up with survivors, while all we see are the Time Lords and decide at the end of the war between now and the day of the Doctor is the Master. Anyway, moving on from speculation from what could have been to what is. The reintroduction of the Daleks to TV was, in my view at least, an enormous success, and is one of NuWho's best episodes, which is remarkable given how much he had to do and how little time and how small a scope it had to fit it in. This episode was a loose adaptation of the Big Finish audio story Jubilee, which I reviewed recently, but for those who are unaware of that story, or Big Finish in general, that story was a masterpiece, a tour de force in exploring the Daleks and what they are, and my 14-minute review barely begun to scratch the surface of its depth and complexity. Obviously, the structure of it would have been no use in introducing the general public to the Daleks, and of course the whole thing needed to be condensed from 2 hours to 45 minutes, so this was never going to be able to be a straight retelling. But I think writer Rob Shearman, who wrote both, was smart in adapting Jubilee mostly in thematic sense rather than the plot sense, which is good, because it shows he had the important things down. In the end, the plot is immaterial when its themes and characters are meant to drive this story, and that is one of this episode's major strengths. It takes the parts of Jubilee most applicable to this very different situation while creating something new. This episode is a classic, make no mistake. While overall its storytelling is weaker than Jubilee, as I said in that review, it is for reasons that entirely make sense. It is in a visual medium, has to appeal to a wider audience, and has far less time to do it, which is why, for instance, handprint Ex Machina is used as the linchpin of the Dalek's transformation, far simpler than the slow mental change of the Dalek in Jubilee. And Rose's relationship with this Dalek is far less complex than Evelyn's with the Jubilee Dalek. She doesn't really know its true nature and is first manipulated into empathising with it, and is eventually left with it being entirely a product of her emotions. And I want to make it clear, these aren't criticisms of this episode. On the contrary, these are positive things about it, but it managed to successfully adapt these ideas and themes into the new format, and make them structurally and thematically successful, and not undertake the usual NuWho way of doing things, which would have been to carve for it all for mindless spectacle and browser history jokes, which would especially be applicable due to Van Satten owning the internet in the story, but I digress. The point I am meandering my way to is that this episode in a way succeeds precisely because it manages to avoid so many of NuWho's usual pitfalls, but not by completely eschewing them. We get the cool moments, but they feel far more earned, and far more part of the progression of the story, the character and the themes. One of the most memorable moments of the Daleks' whole return to NuWho is the first time it flies. The general public, of course, not having a clue something called Remembrance of the Daleks ever existed, but that is a moment that's earned in the story. It plays an important role in establishing the threat of the Daleks, and it's short and focused, rather than the Doctor skydiving after the TARDIS for no reason other than to have a cool spectacle on the screen for 5 minutes, for instance. Now, admittedly, perhaps if I was to be very cynical, I would say this is what happens when you put NuWho in the hands of a writer who actually knows what he's doing, but I shan't, and I will simply rue this was Shearman's only contribution to the TV series. I have to imagine that was at least somewhat of a mutual decision, but along with Paul Cornell, who wrote another excellent Series 1 episode in Father's Day, and returned only to adapt his Human Nature novel in Series 3, you have to wonder why these obvious talents were not brought back when we had to put up with shit written by Gareth Roberts pretty much every year for a decade. Every time you sit down and watch the Doctor pretending he can speak baby in front of James Corden, which is hopefully not very often, just imagine what we could have had been getting instead. Even in excellence, NuWho finds some way to disappoint. Anyway, let's go on to the episode itself and first to production. The director of this was Joe Ahearne. Ahearne? Oh, I don't know. Anyway, he directed 5 of the 13 episodes of this series, which sounds like a lot, but when your alternative is Keith Boak, I suspect you'd go for someone like him instead, so... It's obviously a story we'll probably never know the full details behind, but the generally accepted consensus about Ahearne is that he took Eccleston's side in the dispute with RTD, which is why he never returned after this series, and why his directing was apparently a condition of Eccleston's return that never was for the 50th anniversary. As for his actual work on the series, I think he overall is a very good director, and after 3 of the previous 5 episodes in the story having been Keith Boak's handiwork, a welcome one to be frank. Ahearne, I think, deserves praise for a lot of the aspects of the episode. While it's not a flashy or mind-blowing job or anything like that, it's not Graham Harper or Androzani, you know, I think it does an absolutely fantastic job with the pacing and manages to keep things tight and focused where it needs to be. For instance, in the final confrontation between the Doctor and the Dalek, the angles and editing emphasises the Doctor's emotions and reactions, making sure the focus of the scene is on those elements of the script and not bogged down elsewhere. Equally, when the Doctor is having a little rant which ends with him telling the Dalek to unalive itself, as the TikTok kids say these days, or kill itself if you're not an idiot, the camera very smartly stays focused on the Doctor for the whole of his entire short rant, letting us see up close to his anger and letting Eccleston's performance speak for itself. Is this taking the already excellent material on the page and elevating it that makes these scenes so memorable? But there are other areas he does that too. When the Dalek is first breaking out and exterminating all the soldiers, this in theory could be a mundane scene, and I think there are plenty of lesser NuWho directors who would let the actions and effects stand by themselves, but Ahearne doesn't do this. He instead makes the small changes needed to enhance the menace, focusing on a slower, smaller moments such as the disintegrating bullets, the Dalek happy just sit there and bide its time to show how little of a threat these soldiers are, and in the effortless dance it does in choosing and dispatching his victims. It really does a fantastic job in the space of like a minute in showing the audiences why the Doctor was so right to react so negatively against this thing. Overall, he does a great job here. Other than that, the production doesn't have too much to discuss, as it doesn't have a particularly huge scope and, being set in an underground bunker and all, not exactly an opportunity for sweeping vistas. There's 2 things I'll talk about. First, the new Dalek design, and count me as Mr. Contrarian, but I've never liked these bronze Daleks, even when I was a kid watching for the first time. As a colour, I don't think it works on them, it makes them look too drab and boring. It's the same problem the 70s and 80s gunmetal look had, and I didn't like that much either. A light grey or white I think brings out the best shape in them, and the original grey and blue is always the best for me, so I'm not a huge fan, but I'll accept that as a personal thing, doesn't really affect anything very much other than how I feel about it. Less so is the second thing, where we repeat the remembrance thing of having this flashy new extermination effect, and it being blatantly obvious the effects budget could not stretch to its extensive use. Now, this is more forgivable than it was there for 2 reasons. First, you do at least get a good few exterminations within that scene, as I discussed before, where it does effectively ramp up the menace, rather than just having one time and that's it. And secondly, the avoid showing it again bit is handled more gracefully than in Remembrance, with Ahearne having deaths off screen and handling the Dalek electrocuting everyone instead as it just doing it because it can. It's found an easier way to kill, and that's what Daleks do. But it is, again, letting the effects drive the story rather than the other way around, so while it's handled much better, it's still a bit of an annoyance, especially as how much of a NuWho staple it has become. But given this is pretty much my only criticism of the episode, that I think is that it shows what a good episode it is. So that brings us to the scripts, and I think I'll first start by taking the relevant comparisons from Jubilee and seeing how they were transferred over, as the themes and parts of the plot this relates to rather than the characters, which are all different, for the most part, but we'll get to that. The basic idea of examining the nature of the Daleks and what effect they can have remains. It's less of course about how they insidiously inspire a total fascist takeover of the world, and more about how it affects like 2 people, but again, it's a good thing it's being properly adapted for a smaller scale. We focus on the Doctor, and to a lesser extent Rose and Van Statten, and what the Dalek brings out in them. It's the same idea, using the Daleks to examine these people and how they've been changed. It also examines the nature of Daleks and how that can be changed. Again, the adaptation will change, but it means it becomes less about the Dalek being worn down by time and the weight of its encounters and interactions, and has to be because of sciencey stuff. Alright, I'm mostly being generous to this episode, but I will be honest and say what it actually is, technobabble ex machina, but again, that's not a criticism, it's a necessary change on adaptation, and it does make sense. In order to renew itself, it got the time energy, and took some of the DNA as well. I'm not sure how it makes complete sense, but given what we'll get in the Series 3 Dalek story, we'll take what we can get here. Another main theme carried over is power, but we'll get to that when we look at the character of Van Statten. But again, like how that was examined in Jubilee, it's carried over here, but examined differently. We see it from a different angle to get the same result, essentially. Moving on from that, it's impossible to discuss the Daleks in the early years of NuWho without referencing the Time War. It was a device invented by RTD essentially as a means of clearing the continuity, without having the baggage of decades of Time Lord lore, something I'm also doing steady reviews on, which shows how much material there was there, and to avoid all that bogging down the new series. Which does baffle me a bit, because if you don't want to mention the Time Lords, you can just not mention the Time Lords, Russell. You can do that. The show managed 6 years without ever saying their name, and a further 7 after that before we actually had a story set on Gallifrey, which is a name we wouldn't hear until about halfway through that 7 years. hopefully you get what I mean from that. Never including them and at most mentioning them in passing would have achieved the same effect. It's not like we needed visits to Gallifrey or stuff involving the Time Lords. It just seems to me like it was a bit of a solution in search for a problem, and one that was not consequence-free. It meant the Daleks coming back, because obviously they would have to frequently because they're the Daleks, but it meant that would quickly lose its power, as it turned out several Daleks did in fact survive. And we see the sequence. We see, oh, there's one Dalek in this story, excellent. The Emperor creating a new race, alright, fine, we'll roll with it. And then suddenly, oh, it's the Cult of Skaro, oh, it's Davros who survived, oh, it's these ones survived, and then we basically create the entire new Dalek race, and they're more for error to make sure it never happened in the first place. It also completely locked out the Time Lords and their storytelling possibilities. Again, I completely agree with RTD, if it's not something you do early on, absolutely not. You give it at least like 3 or 4 series before you even touch Gallifrey with a barge pole if you're starting anew with Doctor Who. But given RTD himself finished off his first era of a Time Lord-centered story, clearly you could do it when appropriate. That's the key, when appropriate. It locked off 2 of the most important elements of the show unnecessarily, in my view. And what did we get in return? Well, I can see that it led to a lot of good character work in quite a few episodes, mostly early on, and this episode is one of them, and indeed it provided the basis for a lot of characterisation right up until the 50th anniversary when the story arc reached its natural conclusion with the restoration of Gallifrey. Only for Chibnall to fuck it up and then RTD to embrace going right back into his comfort zone, making it second time as fast, but that's very much getting off topic. The point is, it did work in places, and it would have made this a very different, and I think without much doubt a certainly weaker episode, but this just became too convenient of a device to fall back on, which led to all the fucking moping, which just became so grating because it never went anywhere. The Ninth Doctor and Narka coming to terms with what happened, which reached its natural conclusion in the finale, and then it just kept fucking going until the 10th Doctor was being made to yell, "I never would," and make everyone cringe out of their skins. It became too simplistic and too easy, which is why, despite some appreciation for the successes in the Ninth Doctor's arc in particular, and other bits throughout the show, the whole concept of the Time War still irks me, because in the end it just felt overused and underdeveloped and not worth the narrative sacrifices it entailed. I don't know, perhaps I'm just too much of a fanboy for the Deadly Assassin, but that is my 2 cents, and no doubt I'll expand further on this as we go through these first few Dalek stories in NuWho. But, and this is a big but, as I just said, the episode would be much lesser than what it is if not for the Time War. The strength of the Doctor's motivation comes from the war, his experience of it and how it has changed him. Shearman makes the very smart choice of losing much of Jubilee that surrounded the Doctor would have been impossible to adapt into the scope and time available, and instead focus it down on him. The 6th Doctor in that story hated the Daleks, but no more so than he would have done at any other point in the classic run. You can imagine his disdain for their nature and his disgust of what they have horrifically inspired the humans of that world to come from, say, the 1st Doctor in the aftermath of Master Plan, or the 3rd Doctor while he's in his exile on Earth. Their hatred of the Daleks was based on what they had seen them do, which fitted in with the nature of the theme surrounding him in Jubilee, but with all that stripped away, that would have been insufficient. The Doctor's reaction to the Dalek in this episode can only have been from the 9th Doctor, and from only at this point in his life. The Doctor is not just coming face to face with his arch-nemesis yet again, it's a wound being torn open and salt rubbed into it. The reveal scene of the Dalek is, on the surface, lifted directly from Jubilee. The Doctor enters the darkened room, not knowing what's in there, and being horrified when it turns out to be a Dalek, and his fear lessens when he realises it's unable to harm him. There are a few minor differences. The 6th Doctor is immediately recognised by the Dalek, while the 9th has to introduce himself, and it's the word Doctor that sets the Dalek off, for instance, but only minor stuff like that. But the scene plays out in basically the same way, initially. The difference is that the 6th Doctor has a smug interaction with the Dalek, starts to piece together what's happening and there's more at play, and then the interaction is over when the others come in. It's no more than the means of introducing the Dalek in a state of play. And that's because, as I said, that story had so much more to cover, while this episode does not, and Shearman manages that change masterfully. The 9th Doctor has suddenly been confronted, essentially by a ghost, coming face to face with an enemy he thought vanquished. And the reaction to having that wound torn open, to unload all the trauma, all the guilt, to taunt it, to let his hatred flow out into the open, to let every scenario about what he would do if he ever saw a Dalek again play out, to make sure that it knew how much he hated it. And of course the scene plays double duty in that it lets the Doctor exposit about the Time War, letting the audience learn just as much as the other characters do, but done in such a way as to feel natural. It comes out of him jeering and taunting the Dalek, letting him know there's nothing left, and that leads on. And I also think the scene plays into the other theme I mentioned, power. The power shifts back and forth, first with the Dalek before the Doctor realises it can't use his weapon, then with the Doctor as he jeers the Dalek and tells it has no hope of rescue or survival at all, it is the last relic of the destroyed Empire. And yet the Dalek turns the tables with just one simple line.
I am alone in the universe.
Yep.
So We are the same.
We're not the same, I'm not...
I think it's clear that was pretty high up the list of things the Doctor did not want to hear at that particular moment, and whatever emotional regulation he had disappears as he starts torturing the Dalek just the same as Van Statten's men would. In the end, the Dalek won the verbal battle with just one taunt, letting the Doctor's grief and guilt become an open flowing wound. This scene is pretty much flawless, with incredible performance of raw rage from Eccleston, and Nicholas Briggs showing what he was able to do with the Dalek voice. There's more depth and complexity in this one sequence of a few minutes than the entire of, well, several Moffat-era series, never mind any individual episodes. And just to piss you off again with a reminder, when you're watching the Doctor babbling nonsense about living with beavers or whatever it was in The Caretaker, remember, you could be watching something done by this writer instead. Don't we live in the best timeline? Through the rest of the episode, we see more of where the Doctor's character is going with this. When the action starts and he has to make the decisions about trying to stop the Daleks, all of the grief is almost at the back of his mind, letting him focus on what he does best, defeating alien menaces. But it's always there in the background, always a reminder of what this is. It's only when it speaks to him again does he lose control once more. Is he letting his anger get the better of him? Is this now honestly how he thinks and feels whenever the Daleks are involved and pretends it's long gone? Or is this him seeing the Daleks suggestible and thinking he has the means of stopping it? Or a combination of the three, probably most likely. But his interaction leads to...
If you want orders, follow this one. Kill yourself.
The Daleks must survive!
The Daleks have failed! Why don't you finish the job and make the Daleks extinct? Rid the universe of your filth! Why don't you just die?
You would make a good Dalek.
There's two things I think I have to say about that. One, that the Doctor's grief and guilt has stripped him down, and when his control breaks, he will just scream in rage. Eccleston ending up literally foaming at the mouth was probably a happy accident for Ahearne. And two, that the Dalek once again gets the last word. A cold barb of him to remind him of everything he did, and everything he now harbours. Right now, sure, the Doctor isn't going around exterminating extras in the occasional speaking part, so he is morally above the Dalek in that sense, but we're left to think what this might be reminding him of what deeds during the war that go unspoken, but gnawing at the Doctor forever. When he has to seal the vault with Rose inside as his only means of stopping the Dalek, that grief and guilt is in full force, happy to lash out and blame basically everyone. And in the end, despite how much of a prick he is, Van Statten had no idea what this thing was. Its escape was largely out of his control. His only real crime was keeping it in the first place, and again, he didn't know what a threat it was. And what was Adam supposed to do? Use his mind to prevent the heavy steel blast all from coming down? But at that moment, the Doctor doesn't care about any of that. It's another death on his conscience, another death because of his conflict with the Daleks, when he thought that his one comfort on this all being over was that he'd never have to have that thought again, and he is reliving everything again. The Daleks are killing again, and have killed someone he cares about, and he cannot believe that this is happening again, and he is not able to stop it. It's therefore no surprise he can't bring himself to risk her dying when he sees the Dalek is using her as a hostage. Now, the funny thing about this moment is that the Dalek is almost certainly bluffing. It has already realised it's not capable of killing her, but the Doctor is not thinking clearly enough to try and work that out. All he sees is a chance to avoid one more death from this conflict, to right at least one wrong from this thing that has consumed his soul. There's nothing else he can do. Well, apart from go and grab a BFG from Adam's collection, when all else fails, a massive fucking cannon will do the job. Of course, knowing his luck with the Daleks recently, it will be made by Acme Corporation, we'll have a joke bang flag come out, well, before the Dalek goes meep meep and merrily speeds past. Well, no, actually, he's quite ready to blow the Dalek to Kingdom Come, and it takes Rose to talk him down into realising that the Dalek is changing. What he was too blinded to see by his guilt and rage, Rose has been at the forefront of seeing the change. And the Doctor is talked down enough to realise the tragedy of the situation, something new coming from this Dalek, something that by its nature will have to die, and the audience is left to guess how much closure the Doctor finally had from this. Probably not very much, but seeing at least one life saved and the Dalek destroyed by a rejection of his changing nature maybe gives him something. This is just a phenomenally handy character arc, and well, I hate to flog this dead horse, but makes you want to weep at what NuWho could have been if we had had this more often instead of TARDIS skydiving and browser history jokes. The effortlessly complexity portrayed in what's really just a few scenes, maybe 15 minutes worth of screen time, once you cut out the setup, the coda, and all the scenes the Doctor isn't in, and yet with just a few interactions, decisions, and knowing they could rely on Eccleston to deliver the goods in his performance, it's an incredible success. This is the Ninth Doctor at his finest. As for the other characters, Rose plays a vital role in this, albeit without being really about her. She's there to set up the character stuff for the Doctor and the Dalek, and that's fine. It doesn't always need to be about her, which someone should have told RTD for next year, or Just told Moffat about Clara in general, but I digress. Her role is one that is adapted from Jubilee, but while in that story Evelyn knew of the Daleks, and it was therefore the extended interactions with the one Dalek that led her to becoming more sympathetic with it. Now, we don't have anything like the time for that, so it needs to be condensed down, but I will praise the episode for structuring it so well. Rose doesn't know of the initial confrontation between the Doctor and a Dalek because she's stuck with Adam, so when she finally meets the Dalek she has no idea what it really is. It's the first time she's ever seeing it, which makes its manipulation of her the easiest thing imaginable. I imagine if it had eyes, it would be doing the comical cartoon puppy eyes, and she falls for it hook, line and sinker. But again, that's fine. Structurally it works, it gets to the desired point, shows the Dalek is smart enough to manipulate her, and avoids the death of all those people being her fault. She had absolutely no way of knowing better. Later on in the episode, it's Rose who is primarily interacting with the Dalek, and in seeing it change and managing to convince it to recognise this change. And I think it's a credit to her nature of being open enough to see all that, and is therefore she's able to negotiate with it, and she's the one who saves Van Statten's life from it. But as mentioned, she also becomes the Doctor's moral anchor, in a way to bring him away from the dark and back to the light, which is a common enough way for the companion to be used, being the moral anchor. But it's a nicely constructed double-edged sword that she was also the reason he had to let the Dalek go. He cares enough for her to be both a strength and a weakness. So overall, while it's not her story, she's used very well, and Piper delivers the goods, definitely. As for the supporting cast, Henry Van Statten is the very rich arsehole who owns the vault, and all in it, including the Dalek. He is, inevitably, an archetype. It's not as if very rich arseholes are usually written any other way, to be fair. But the character works despite that because of how he plays into this theme of power. While he does the typical rich stuff, pomposity, flexing his power, treating those below him as expendable in order to protect his acquisitions and wealth, etc. and so forth, it's the way this is all threaded into that theme that makes it work so well. He starts out as a man who has enormous amounts of power. He can have a bloke dragged away and mind-wiped just for annoying a bit. He controls presidential elections in the US, although the next one after this episode is set would be 2016, so the less we dwell on the implications of that one, the better, I think. And yet, we already see the deep insecurity that shows the cracks in this position, as the Dalek won't acknowledge him, and that is gnawing at him. And as the situation disintegrates and the Dalek begins its rampage, his facade of power disintegrates with it. He goes from worrying about his prize being damaged to being genuinely fearful for his life, realizing he has no way of stopping this thing. And indeed, when the Dalek does contact them, it makes it pretty clear he has absolutely no interest in talking to him and only wants to speak to the Doctor, which is about as obvious as it could be that he is most certainly the monkey and not the organ grinder in this situation. In Jubilee, Farrow thought he was a man who could wield power, and it was the Dalek that showed him that he was unwilling to do what he was happy to order others to do. Power was the ability to do what must be done, and not simply allow it to happen in the background. For Van Statten it is similar. Power is all well and good when you're speaking to college wimps and presidents who can't keep their dick in their trousers, but when the chips are down and he is faced with something that challenges that power, he collapses. And thus Goddard, his new PA, who has been the figure of confidence and competence throughout, is able to depose him at the end of the episode with a snap of a finger. All his status and power long gone, he's just a man who is swept away by someone far more competent than he is. And in the end, he'll lose everything. Apparently in the book adaptation of the episode, Goddard is actually an undercover FBI agent, but I don't like that idea at all. It's just too cliché for the situation. I like the idea the episode itself presents, that she is ruthless, ambitious, much smarter than Van Statten, and very happy to bide her time until she can get that power, and is very happy to wield it when she has it. While Van Statten is not the most original character in the world, he is a very effective one, helped by a great performance from Corey Johnson, who plays off Eccleston very well, and has the benefit of actually being American, and therefore not subjecting us to Doctor Who's usual attempts at American accents. If only we could be so lucky when we get to New York in a few stories' time. Finally, there's Adam, and he's mostly here to set up the next episode where he plays a more significant part, but I think the line is walked quite neatly here, making him fairly likeable, but, well, also not to put too fine a point on it, a bit of a drip. You can see why Rose might like him with his rough around the edges charm, but it also makes perfect sense why he's not suited to TARDIS travel, and why what happens next time, well, happens. That, and providing the plot anchor for the BFG that's very important to the resolution of the Doctor's arc, the character is well used, even if he's mostly there to set up next time. I suppose I should briefly touch on the plot, but to be honest, there's not really that much to talk about that I haven't already, or I'm going to shortly. The way the episode is structured is very good, but it allows all its elements to weave together, so I've already talked about most of it because of how it all relates. The plot elements themselves are very simple. Dalek escapes, how do we stop it? But it's the character, the interaction, the themes that drive the plot and give it its depth. It's all weaved together and it's very effective, so I'll leave it there as there are more important things to discuss. Like, for instance, the Daleks themselves, or Dalek singular in this case. The brief for bringing back the Daleks was obvious. They had become a bit of a joke throughout the later part of the classic series. Genesis of the Daleks, which was about halfway through the classic run, let's not forget, was the last time they were menacing or powerful in any way, and Remembrance, where it looked like they could be defeated by a well-lobbed rock, came close to being the nadir of that. So what needs to be done was obvious. Make the Daleks menacing again. There were physical ways to do this, of course. Design a new prop so they wouldn't, wobble as much. Get a voice actor who could put the power in the voice necessary, get directors who would shoot them properly, and they did all this. But it needs to be in the writing as well. The success of this over the whole run of NuWho is patchy, to say the least, but in Series 1 at least the assignment was understood and met. In this episode, Shearman uses the opportunity of only having a single Dalek, and shows that even this one Dalek, alone, with no chance of reinforcements, is an enormous threat. It's not just how it slices through all the soldiers like butter, but in the small things as well. His easy manipulation of Rose, for instance, showing how intelligent it is. But there are two key scenes that are important for understanding how well this works. Firstly, the flying scene, and yes, this has already been done, but Remembrance was only remembered by Doctor Who fans and not the general public, so it was important to establish. No, the jokes are obviously wrong, the Daleks are not defeated by stairs. It was a very smart move to have it so that the characters, for a moment, think they have this thing caught out, which in an odd way immediately clues the audience in that that's not going to be the case, as why it would have been a very short episode ending at around the 20-minute mark if so. When it does fly, it's a shock to the audience, not least because it results in the death of a speaking character who had quite a bit to do over the last 5 minutes or so that preceded this scene. The Daleks are not rickety wobbly dustbins anymore, and this scene is one simple trick that proves that. Secondly, there's a scene where the Dalek isn't even in it, where Van Statten is trying to understand the Dalek and the Doctor is explaining to him its nature.
Then why not just reason with this Dalek? It must be willing to negotiate. There must be something it needs. Everything needs something.
What's the nearest town?
Salt Lake City.
Population?
1 million.
All dead. If the Dalek gets out, it'll murder every living creature. That's all it needs.
But why would it do that?
Because it honestly believes they should die. Human beings are different, and anything different is wrong. It's the ultimate in racial cleansing.
See, what I like about this is it doesn't overstate the case. Even the Doctor says in the episode, some bullets can get through a shield, and if you aim for the eye stalk, you might get a lucky shot and stop it. And indeed, this thing isn't a threat to the entire world. It might create a massacre in Salt Lake City, of course, which would obviously be horrifying, but it's not, going to destroy the entire world. It's unlikely a Katanka high-explosive shell, never mind a large-scale missile, or if worse came to the worst, a nuke. It's not civilization ending, but it doesn't have to be. The fact it takes a very lucky shot, or essentially the destruction of an entire city until the military apparatus of the most powerful country in the world is thrown at it, to stop one Dalek, demonstrates the point well enough, and means that when we do see an army of them later in the series, the threat is all the more obvious. It's not invincible, no good villain would be, otherwise any victory feels like a cheat, but just one is causing this many problems, it really gets the message across. Whatever issues NuWho would throw up later down the line in typical NuWho fashion, this episode does a masterful job of making the Daleks menacing and threatening again. It feels like they're a threat to be reckoned with, which is very rarely the case in the later parts of the classic series. As for this one Dalek, as I said way earlier, its transformation is much more simple than it was in Jubilee, because for the millionth time, that story had 2 hours to develop it, this is 45 minutes, and so handprint ex machina is used. And once again, it's not a criticism, because it is adapting for a different medium and a different audience, and it does it very well. It's reaching the same end, a Dalek changing its nature, realising what that nature is, and how it's being affected by this change. This Dalek, like the one in Jubilee, is a drone, unused to taking control, and needing its orders, but it's not defined by that. It's happy to follow the primary Dalek instinct, as it says. But in the end, it knows it's hollow. Without its orders, it has no point, no direction. It's a very different way of looking at this part of the Daleks. Not mindless without orders. It's still a very intelligent and destructive being, but that's all it is without them. It has no way of directing that idea of what it needs to be. And the change in it, while caused and directed by the outside force of Rose's DNA MacGuffin, nevertheless sees the Dalek begin to question itself and its way of life. But I think it does work that, unlike in Jubilee, the result is not defiance to the Daleks, because it's not had the experience, the time in captivity, and the interactions to change it. The result is horror itself, because while the change has happened, the change in its mind has not. This is sudden and unexpected, and is not something the Dalek can deal with. It's not life, it is sickness, the Dalek says, because it knows nothing else other than this. In a lot of ways, this one Dalek is an avatar for the Daleks as a whole, and thus is not able to be as individualistic as the one in the audio, but that doesn't matter because it's different where it counts. The show and highlight the change and the examination of the Daleks' nature. Which was important because for all the need to introduce the Daleks to the new audience, it was important not just to show what they look like and what they do and all that. Exterminate is the beginning of them as an enemy and not the end. It was important to show what the Daleks are, and which is why I think choosing Shearman and adapting Jubilee was such a good decision, because it was the perfect vehicle for showing that. Nobody will come away not understanding what a Dalek is, precisely because this one Dalek evolved and changed, and showed us moved beyond that. And indeed the reactions of the Doctor and the other characters showed us just as well. Maybe Dalek isn't perfect, an odd clunky line of dialogue here and there, a few bits of pacing issues, and the production in Series 1 always has an odd feel to it, as best highlighted in Murray Gold's odd-sounding music from before he got the orchestra. But even then it's stuff you can overlook, not least because we got the great Dalek theme from this episode. It makes the Daleks menacing, exciting, and interesting. It gives the Doctor a powerful character arc that lends credence to both his experiences in the war and to the Daleks as an enemy, and it's given the backdrop of a tight and effective plot that makes excellent use of the NuWho episode format and adapts its source material very well. It's probably no exaggeration to say that NuWho Dalek stories will never get this good again, and while I have shit like pig slaves, pit spitfires in space, eggs in the asylum, and industrial ovens all to come and make me cross, you know what, it was worth it, because for 45 minutes, the Daleks were back. They were powerful and menacing and exciting again, and they were at their best for this very brief 45-minute moment. Final score for this episode is 10 out of 10. It's smartly written with great character work and well produced to make this one Dalek feel like the greatest menace the Doctor will face, which is important because that's what the Daleks should feel like. Superbly written, and as I said, it's a pity Shearman never returned to the TV series because all his other Big Finish stories were great. But then again, if Shearman had written a few more episodes, we might not have had room for Love and Monsters or Kill the Moon, and that would have been a travesty, right? Ugh. But yeah, this is an excellent episode, a worthy successor to the audio, and sets the benchmark for the Daleks' appearances in NuWho.